Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson, and this is episode 3 of Keep It Real. And what we talk about on this show is real food, real medicine, and real change. And today, with flu season fast approaching, we're going to talk about some aspects about your immune system that you may not be aware of. We're going to talk about a situation that's called chronic immune activation. And I'm going to talk about a couple different studies that teach us about how this chronic immune activation can make you more vulnerable to other pathogens like viruses and stuff like that. Most cold and flus are a viral infection, and so we're going to talk about how chronic immune activation can make you more vulnerable to getting sick, and then when you do get sick, you're going to be sicker and probably for a longer period of time. And you might have noticed that people say things like, you know, half the people in my office got sick, but the other half didn't. Or some people in my family got sick and some people didn't. But the idea is that everybody's exposed to the same virus. So why did some get sick and some didn't? So let me introduce a study that was done a few years ago on macaques. Macaques are a kind of monkey, and they're used oftentimes in research for HIV and AIDS. And they're a research model because something very similar happens to them when they get infected with a similar virus as HIV. In monkeys, it's called SIV, or simian immunodeficiency virus. And a very similar thing happens. They also progress into AIDS after a period of time of their CD4 count dropping out just like it does in humans, and then they progress to AIDS. So stay with me for a sec on this. I'll kind of wrap this back into what this has to do with flu season. But here's the idea, is that when they give rhesus macaques this SIV virus, their CD4 drops out and they usually progress into AIDS about 2 years later. But then they also figured out that when they give another kind of macaque called a pigtail macaque, when they gave them the SIV virus, similar to HIV, they progressed to AIDS in about 6 months. So researchers thought, wow, that's interesting. Maybe this can be an interesting model to figure out why in humans this might happen. Some people might progress into AIDS faster than others. And so what they figured out is, to make a long story short, and this is a very complex, very, very sophisticated study that the researchers did, and what they figured out is it's all about the amount of chronic immune activation that the macaques were going under. And what they figured out is that pigtail macaques have chronic immune activation. And that chronic immune activation has already left them depleted in their immune system. And so getting one more infection, like the SIV viral infection, they progress to AIDS much, much faster than the rhesus macaques. And so they went, well, why is that? Why do these pigtail macaques have a greater degree of chronic immune activation than the rhesus macaques? And what they did was they evaluated a bunch of inflammatory markers, and they traced those inflammatory markers back to the gastrointestinal tract. And what they figured out is that these pigtail macaques have leaky gut. Leaky gut is a compromise to this single cell layer thick barrier system, the gastrointestinal tract, that when that breaks down, the floodgates for inflammation are really allowed to dump into the system, and that can cause chronic immune activation. And so in these pigtail macaques, that's just part of their makeup, that they have this, and so that's why they progress into AIDS so much faster. And so what the heck does this have to do with flu season? What this has to do with flu season is humans get the same thing. Humans could also get breakdown of that intestinal barrier system, what we call leaky gut. And if humans have this leaky gut, they also will have chronic immune activation. And if you throw one more pathogen on top of that, like a common flu virus, then they're going to get the flu, and when they get it, it's gonna probably last a lot longer than in people who don't have this type of leaky gut and chronic immune activation. So the idea is that this is kind of a hidden drag on your immune system that you may not be aware of. You think of your immune system like, oh, you get sore throat, you get a headache, but so much of your immune system lies around your gastrointestinal tract. So the health of your GI tract is absolutely vital for the immune system in the rest of your body. So I would encourage you to learn more about your own integrity of your gastrointestinal tract, and you can ask your physician about this. There's different tests that are out there that you could actually measure the integrity of your gastrointestinal tract. But here's the thing, there's lots of things that can break down your gut barrier, leading to what we call leaky gut. And here's a few things. What they found in the macaque study is that these macaques that had a greater degree of leaky gut had something called dysbiosis in their gastrointestinal tract. And that is caused by too much bad bacteria. We call it gram-negative bacteria. So don't worry about these big, it's kind of scientific words, but there's an endotoxin that's produced by this gram-negative bacteria called LPS, or lipopolysaccharides. And this is a very, very inflammatory chemical in the system. And so here's the deal. You get bad bacteria building up in the gut. That creates LPS. LPS breaks down the integrity of your gut barrier, and boom, that causes chronic immune activation. And then you throw in, a common flu virus, and you're going to get the flu. And it's probably going to last longer than people who don't have this underlying issue. So what else can cause this leaky gut? So leaky gut, or breakdown of this barrier system, could be caused by, like I said, imbalance of bacteria, but also some other really common things. Stress. There's a hormone that's produced by your adrenal glands called cortisol, and cortisol is very well known to break down the integrity of your gut barrier. Another thing is alcohol. Unfortunately, if you have, the studies show that if you have what they called a binge drinking episode, which a binge is just 4 drinks. 4 drinks equals a binge, and a binge of alcohol causes significant breakdown of your gut barrier. So if you already have this bad bacteria in your gut and you binge drink, that's going to cause a flood of these inflammatory chemicals into the body. So that's already 2 things. If you have imbalance of your gut bacteria, if you're exposed to too much stress and too much alcohol, that's 3 things. A 4th very common thing is ibuprofen. Very simple, common medication, anti-inflammatory ibuprofen like Advil, Motrin, that kind of stuff, also breaks down the integrity of the gut barrier. So then that circles back to the question of, why is there a flu season in the first place? Can you start to connect the dots and see? So the holidays can be a stressful time. It could be a super happy, fun, get together with family and friends time, but it could also be very stressful for some people. And so if you add the stress, I think for most people more alcohol is consumed during the holidays. If you add to that, if you have too much alcohol, you're probably going to have ibuprofen the next day because you have a hangover. You add some ibuprofen and you put that all together with some imbalance of bacteria in your gut, that's going to cause really significant and probably chronic, meaning probably several months during the flu season and the holiday season, you're going to have breakdown of that gut barrier. So it's going to make you more vulnerable to getting this chronic immune activation, and then you get viral exposure, and there's your onset of the flu. So those are just a few things to think about there, but there's one more that I have to add in here. So you should know that I'm a proponent of the gluten-free diet, and it's not a fad, and I'm going to explain why it's not a fad diet. And it's something that we all have to understand a little bit more about, so that we're not just getting ideological about, oh, that gluten stuff, a bunch of wacky people are gluten-free. Let me just explain a very important, sophisticated study that was done. And this was published last year in a journal called Nutrients. And the study was published by top-tier researchers. These are people that are experts in the field of leaky gut and gluten sensitivity and gluten-related disorders like celiac disease. So here's what they did, real quickly. They took 4 groups. One group had what they called remission celiac disease, meaning that they have celiac disease, but they're on a gluten-free diet, and so they're in remission. They had an active celiac disease group, which means that they have celiac disease, but they're on a gluten-free diet, or they're not on a gluten-free diet, so they have active celiac disease. They took a third group, which had gluten sensitivity, but no celiac disease. So they didn't have the autoimmune condition of celiac disease, but they had a gluten-related disorder called gluten sensitivity, or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And then they took a fourth group, a group that did not have celiac disease and did not have gluten sensitivity. And what they did is they gave all the groups gluten. And then they did something very sophisticated. They did a biopsy of the gastrointestinal tract to measure the integrity of that gut barrier. And so they gave people with active celiac disease gluten, and it was really no surprise that sure enough, they got leaky gut. When they measured the biopsy of their gut barrier, there was breakdown of their gut barrier, and so that's leaky gut. And then they measured the integrity of the gut barrier after giving a little bit of gluten to people with celiac disease in remission. And so these are people who have celiac disease but were on a gluten-free diet, and so maybe that wasn't real surprising. They also got leaky gut. But then they tested people who don't have celiac disease, but they just have gluten sensitivity, and they measured the integrity of their gut barrier after a dose of gluten, and guess what they found out? They too got leaky gut. So these people without celiac disease, they just have symptoms that when they consume gluten, they gave them gluten, and it actually broke down the integrity of that important gut barrier system. But then they gave people who have no celiac disease and no gluten sensitivity, they gave them gluten, and guess what? They got leaky gut also. And so I'll paraphrase what the researchers actually wrote in their published research, that gluten consumption causes leaky gut in everybody. So this is by the top tier researchers in the field of celiac disease, gluten-related disorders, and leaky gut. So we put that together with the information that we just talked about, that when you have breakdown of your gut barrier, then you're more prone to this chronic immune activation, and you're more prone to getting sick when there's a, let's call it an opportunistic pathogen in the environment, your work environment or home environment or whatever. So let's put all that together. Alcohol can cause, let's say, they call it binge alcohol, so 4 drinks can break down your gut barrier. Stress can break down your gut barrier. Ibuprofen can break down your gut barrier. Imbalance of bacteria in the gastrointestinal tract, that could break down your gut barrier. And now gluten. So now, can't you see why there's a flu season? It's during this time of the year that all those things are probably consumed in excess or more than what's typical for the individual. So that's just a little food for thought. Taking that information and think about that. Enjoy your holidays. Hope you make some good decisions, and we'll talk to you again real soon.